Welcome to Sunday Sermons from the Williamsburg Community Chapel, brought to you by the Chapel Podcast Network. Let's grab our Bibles and open up to the book of Lamentations, chapter 1, verses 1 through 11. And I'll read the first two verses for us now as we prepare to hear from Travis Simone as he kicks off our new sermon series titled Lament In Exile. How lonely sits the city that was full of people. How like a widow has she become, she who was great among the nations. She who was a princess among the provinces has become a slave. She weeps bitterly in the night, with tears on her cheeks. Among all her lovers, she has none to comfort her. All her friends have dealt treacherously with her. They have become her enemies.
How? Old Testament books were originally titled using the first significant word of the book. The first word of Lamentations is how. What a title for a book. The question is written in response to Babylon's military conquest of Jerusalem in 586 BC. That summer, the walls protecting the city were smashed. The military is defeated. The economy decimated. Religious worship desecrated. The government dissolved. And the people are deported. It's known in history as the exile. One key detail in the story, as it is recorded in 2 Kings 25, is that the king flees the city by running through and out of a garden. This serves as a reminder to the reader of humanity's original home, the Garden of Eden. You see, the exile to Babylon is emblematic of humanity's exile from our true home. We all live east of Eden. Reflecting on this exile to Babylon and the exile from Eden, Lamentations asks the question we've all asked when the reality of our exile bears down on us. How? How? How do I handle this? How do I handle the pain, the broken trust? How do I handle the frustration, the shame, the regret? How do I handle the interminable longing that I experience in my life? How? How do I handle the fact that there are aspects of my life that are far from what I hoped for? Our series on the causes of exile asked the question, how did I get here? Our series on Lament in Exile asks the question, how do I handle this now that I am here? People tend to choose one of three options answering the question, how, in their life. They tend to run from their exile, run through their exile, or lie down in the midst of it. I'm running from it. I'm ignoring it. I'm pretending it's not there. I'm self-medicating with entertainment or alcohol or illicit sexual affairs, whatever it might be. I'm just running from it. Or we're running through it, head down, not going to look to my right or left, just gut it out. Or I lie down in the midst of it and just succumb to the darkness. I ran into, surprisingly, out of nowhere, an old friend this week I hadn't seen in a decade. And this old friend just popped up. And it was in such strange circumstances. I knew that God had brought us together for this in this moment. I had heard that he had had an emotional breakdown, and I had reached out and I tried to connect with him and was not able to, I think due to all of the things he was going to. And I had been wondering what happened and how was he? And then all of a sudden he was there standing right in front of me. I said, "What happened?" He said, "Travis, no one ever taught me how to cope with the reality that would become my life. No one taught me how to cope when my marriage started fading. No one had taught me how to cope with the guilt and shame that came from that fact." And he was specific. He said, "Nothing in my Christian upbringing taught me how to deal with this or even to suspect that it was coming." He tried to run from it. He tried to run through it. And eventually, he laid down in it, ultimately to the point where he had to be hospitalized. "No one taught me how to cope." That phrase just rang in my ear. No one taught me how to cope when the book of Lamentations is sitting right there in the middle of our Bibles. See, Lamentations has a different answer to the question, how do I handle this, than the answers that the world offers. This morning, let Lamentations become our teacher to answer the question, how do I handle this? And the answer is, learn to lament. We must learn to lament. When faced with every symptom of our exile, learn to lament. Learn to lament candidly. Look at verse 1 again. "How lonely sits the city that was full of people. How like a widow she has become. She who was great among the nations, she who was a princess among the provinces, has become a slave." The book starts with a candid assessment of the situation. Notice the stark contrast. A city that was filled with people is now alone. The one who was once great is now a widow. An ancient city, an ancient symbol for poverty and vulnerability. The one who was once a princess is now a slave. It's a total reversal of fortune. 5 times in chapter 1, we hear the sounds of groaning. Verse 4, the groans of the priest. Verse 8, the groans of the city. Verse 11, the groans of the people. Verse 21, it gets personal. My groaning. And verse 22 is clear. My groans are many. Look at verse 2 in your bulletin. She weeps bitterly in the night. Lamentations starts in tears. Lamentations 1, starts in tears, and it ends with groans. Some of the images in Lamentations 1 are just seem too painful to say out loud. I had to carefully select which images I would even choose to explain this week. Look at verse 4, the 4C, I'll call it, the third part of verse 4, and we'll look at 5C as well, and then 11A, the first part of verse 11. 4C, her virgins have been afflicted. 5C, her children have gone away, captives before the foe. 11, all her people groan as they search for bread. Sexual assault, child slavery, human starvation are what these verses described. Verse 17 which you don't have in your bulletins. I went with half the chapter so you could see there are 22 lines of poetry corresponding, as Hunter said, to the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. So I gave you half, but 17 says, Jerusalem has become a filthy thing among them. And the English translators hardly know what to do with this line because it's so dramatic and explicit. The Hebrew is a bloody rag, a blood-soaked rag, a rag that's soaked with the blood of God's people after the siege of Jerusalem. You see, Lamentations gives us language to speak about the unspeakable. Learning to lament candidly means saying out loud that which you dare not say out loud. My advisor from seminary, who's come and preached here a couple times and led some staff development days for us, he wrote a book called Honest to God Preaching. In it, he has a chapter about being honest about suffering. He writes this: no new life comes through denial and cover-up, but new life can and does come through candor about suffering whenever it comes and wherever it comes from. That's our friend Brent Strawn. We all need to learn to speak with candor. I learned this lesson at a difficult time in my life and in the life of our church. Some of you know this, some of you don't know this, but I started off as the interim lead pastor here at the chapel. And I didn't know what an interim pastor was or what an interim pastor was supposed to do. There was only one person in our town that had any experience with interim leadership, and that was the president at William and Mary. And I was sure being the president of William and Mary meant he didn't do free consulting for local pastors. But he started out as the interim president of William and Mary in a tumultuous time. And so I took a shot. I fired off an email. I said, hey, I'm an alum. I'm in a tough spot. You've been in a tough spot before too. You were the interim president. I'm the interim pastor. What do you say? He took the appointment. I went to his wood-paneled office and I asked him, what did you do to calm the situation down at William and Mary? The students were in upheaval. The faculty was in upheaval. Alumni were mad. He said, and he speaks very slowly in an old Virginia accent. He looks at me, he said, I spoke with candor. I said, what do you mean? He said, I gathered every possible constituent group, students, and I spoke with candor. Faculty, I spoke with candor. Alumni, and I spoke with candor. He said, tell me a little bit about what you're going through. I told him the story. He leaned back in his chair, looked me right in the eye, and said, I think it's time for some candor. I think it's time for some candor. Lamentations says it's always time for candor in our lives. And as you process this week in your groups, with your spouse, with your friends, maybe ask yourself the question, what do you need to lament candidly in your life? Don't run from, run through, or lie down in your exile. Learn to lament candidly. And learn to lament completely. I really appreciate the work that the worship and communication teams did on the bulletin this week. As Hunter mentioned, Lamentations is a series of 4 acrostic poems. There are 5 chapters. I'll save the dramatic conclusion and why the 5th chapter is differently for Rich in a few weeks. But it's a series of 4 acrostic poems. The way you can see this in your English translation is fairly simple. All you need to know is one thing about Hebrew, and that is that the Hebrew alphabet has 22 letters, and you can see every chapter has 22 verses or a multiple of 22. The literary device is so dominant and the variations are so carefully crafted, it's clear the author uses the acrostic form not just to write beautiful poetry, but to help readers learn to lament. You see, acrostics help readers work through a subject completely, all the way from A to Z, or Aleph to Taw in Hebrew. They ensure you don't leave anything unexamined. Every emotion, every pain, every instance of shame, every wrong perpetrated against you is acknowledged. The most repeated word in chapter 1, if you just read it and started underlining words that get repeated, the most repeated word in chapter 1 is all. It's repeated 16 times in chapter 1. I didn't have space to list them all on the slides. Here's a sampling. Verse 2, all her lovers and all her friends. Verse 3, all her pursuers have overtaken her. Verse 4, all her gates are desolate. Verse 6, all her majesty has departed. Verse 8, all who mourned her despise her. Verse 11, all her people groan. Verse 21, all my enemies. One biblical scholar writes, the negative repetition of all tolls the totality of Zion's tragedy. I want to be clear also that complete laments go beyond merely considering how we've been hurt. Learning to lament completely means a complete examination of my sin. Maybe ask this question. Did my actions or inaction contribute in any way to the circumstances or consequences I am now handling? Jerusalem's sin is a major part of chapter 1. Look at the first part of verse 5. Her foes have become the head. Her enemies prosper because the Lord has afflicted her. Why? For the multitude of her transgressions. Verse 8, this one's even difficult to read out loud. Jerusalem sinned grievously, therefore she became filthy. All who honored her despise her, for they have seen her nakedness. She herself groans and turns her face away. Nakedness in the Bible is symbolic of shame. People saw her sin, the shame that flowed from it, the guilt. Remember a few weeks ago, I tried to speak to our middle school and high school students exactly the truth of verse 8, Lamentations chapter 1. Sin always makes you go further than you wanted to go. Stay longer than you wanted to stay. And it costs more than you ever wanted to pay. And that's what Jerusalem and God's people are experiencing here. Verse 22 delivers the final all of chapter 1. And the final all of chapter 1 is all my transgressions. That's how chapter 1 ends. A reflection on all the sin of Jerusalem. How tempting it would have been to focus solely on the complete pain of God's people, or the complete suffering of God's people, the complete abject poverty of the circumstances. But learning to lament completely must include an examination of and a confession of sin. Recovery groups have always taught this is part of the healing process. Alcoholics Anonymous, step 4, we made a searching and fearless moral inventory of ourselves. And according to their own literature, I'm not making this connection myself. According to Alcoholics Anonymous' own literature, where they got that principle from? Lamentations 3:40. Let us test and examine our ways and return to the Lord. See, on one level, a complete lament magnifies our sin and suffering. It forces us to reckon with all of it. Yet on another level, the mercy and the healing potential of learning to lament completely is that it always helps you reach the end of your sin and suffering. The acrostic always ends with the Hebrew letter ta, or as we might say in English, learning to lament completely eventually means you'll arrive at Z. You'll get to the end. And at the end of that long, long road, you'll hear Jesus' words from the cross. It is finished. He has made the atoning sacrifice for our sin. We can lament our sin completely because we can trust that in Jesus Christ, God will forgive our sin completely. And this is exactly what God said through Isaiah to mark the end of exile. Isaiah 40, comfort. Comfort for my people, says your God. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem and cry to her that her warfare is ended, that her iniquity is pardoned. Don't run from it. Don't run through it. Don't lie down in it. Learn to lament it completely. And learn to lament it collectively. The most frequent complaint in chapter 1 is that the personified city of Jerusalem has no one to comfort her. No one to comfort her. That's what she's so upset about. It's in verse 2, verse 9, verse 16, verse 17, verse 21, and verse 7 is like a bonus. It says she has no one to help her. This is the core problem that's introduced in chapter 1, verse 1, how lonely sits the city. I'm alone. I'm all alone in all of this. And so what she does is she starts calling on God to look. I'm so alone. God, please look at me. Verse 9, O Lord, behold my affliction, for my enemy has triumphed. Verse 11, look, O Lord, and see, for I am despised. Verse 20, look, O Lord, for I am distressed. My stomach churns. She says, I'm about to vomit here. I'm in so much pain. Would you just look at me, God? Remember, in the way the Hebrew language works, oftentimes the writers will hide the core truth at the very center of the writing. 22 verses in chapter 1 means verse 11 is the center. The centerpiece of the chapter is the personal plea of the woman, please look at me, God. And yet God provides no answer in the words on the page. But God does provide an answer in the structure of the words on the page. You see, the acrostic pattern is designed for people to read it together, collectively, in community. As Hunter mentioned, acrostics are an aid for memorization. The poems of lamentation were not meant to be read in a book by yourself, lonely as the city. These poems were meant to be memorized and repeated collectively in corporate worship, just like we're doing right now. Think of all you'll miss asking, how do I handle this by yourself? You'll miss much needed perspective, much needed comfort, much needed community. My friend, as I mentioned, had such an emotional breakdown. He ended up having to be hospitalized. Sadly, to prevent him from harming himself, he was suicidal. He came close to killing himself on several occasions. He didn't know how to live, how to move on, how to walk through his pain with God by his side. I asked him what the suicide ward was like. He said they should call it the isolation ward. I was all alone by myself. I said, how did you eventually turn the corner? How did you get out? He said, I called 2 friends. Making those phone calls, that was the beginning of the healing process, he said. I know in a room this size, people come in with all kinds of hurt, all kinds of things they're lamenting. If you don't hear anything from me out of the rest of this sermon, please don't leave this room alone. Don't leave without making yourself known. Our associate pastor of care and connection, Hunter Rue, he'll be at the information table after the service. And I'm going to put our website up on the screen here, wcchapel.org/getcare. That could get you connected to, we have a ministry called Stephen Ministry. These are people that are trained listeners, trained to just be a presence with you in the midst of your suffering. Not to try to fix every problem, but just to listen. I think Stephen Ministry would be a great next step if you feel alone in your lament. Go to wcchapel.org/getcare. I bumped into this idea of lament everywhere this week. I was struggling how to end the sermon, and this morning, newspaper article, man named David Roberts and what he learned on his journey with cancer. He said he wanted to share some lessons with his son. He wrote this: before my diagnosis, I was going to give him one bit of advice. It would have been never miss an opportunity to be generous. They are rarer than you think. I wished I had lived that more. But today I'd like to add a corollary. Don't be afraid to allow others those opportunities too. Maybe it's the steroids talking, but what has become clear to me is that without intimate human connection, however fleeting, we are lost. Everything else seems so small by comparison. It feels like something I had always known, perhaps something that deep down we all know. But then real life made me forget. Real life made me forget. Real life makes us all forget. Which is why I want to remind us that God provided the ultimate companion for all who cry, how lonely sits the city. For all who cry, how lonely sits my life. That in the Gospel of Matthew, we see that Jesus Christ shall be called Emmanuel, which means God with us. Jesus Christ is the answer to the prayer at the center of Lamentations. Look, O Lord, and see. Jesus Christ enters our exile to see up close the symptoms of our exile. He sighs in the Gospels at the sight of our blindness. He is moved with compassion that we are like sheep without a shepherd. He weeps at the tomb of his friend Lazarus, and he groans like the writer of Lamentations in the Garden of Gethsemane before he is cast out, exiled from the city of Jerusalem and hung on a cross. See, Jesus loses the city that we might gain the eternal city, our true home, the reunion of the new heavens and the new earth. When we place our faith in him, we no longer need to run from, run through, or lie down in our suffering. Trusting his power can lead us through death and into new life. We can learn to lament candidly, completely, and collectively.
Thank you for joining us today. Here at the Williamsburg Community Chapel, we are all about making disciples of Jesus Christ. So wherever you are on your spiritual journey, we hope you will join us this year as we study the biblical theme of exile and learn how to sing the Lord's song in a foreign land.